Good morning. I'm so happy that you guys are with us for this TMACOG Tech for Nuisance and Abatement. So thank you for getting on this platform with TMACOG. I'm sorry I'm a silhouette, but I am Gilda Mitchell, Director of Membership and Outreach. So I'm so excited that you guys are on with us today. We have some amazing speakers that will be speaking on this topic. Also as well, you might have been receiving emails in regards to our summer caucus. We're going to also have that as a teleconference. So if you are interested in any of those, please look at your email so you can register and sign up. The beautiful thing about our summer caucuses this time around, you can be in any summer caucus that you would like. So we have different time slots. So check your emails for that. And again, I'm excited that we're on here on today, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob Bethel.
Well, good morning, everyone. This is one of these things that we've all kind of gotten used to through this pandemic now, doing these sort of meetings on here. So it's really nice to be able to still have these kind of meetings on there, that we're not completely restricted on our ability to meet and share things. So I appreciate TMACOG putting this on. My role today will be strictly to sort of be the moderator to keep things moving along here, and so I'll be turning it over shortly to our panel of experts on here. But just so you know my background a little bit, I'm with my full-time job is with the Employers Association. I'm the VP of HR and Learning Services, and I've been involved in some of these TMACOG techs for various topics in the past. And when TMACOG approached me about this one, my suggestion was, let's get some real experts in there, because the reason that they even talked to me about it was, in addition to my being with the Employers Association, I'm also a Springfield Township trustee, and I've been in that position for about 18 years. And as a township trustee, I would tell you that this has been the area that has been the greatest part of the learning curve for me regarding township government on there. And so I think it is something that is of interest to a lot of people. I've enjoyed learning about it, but I would tell you, even after 18 years as a trustee, I'm not the expert, but we're fortunate, as I said, to have the experts here today, including Jacob Barnes from Springfield Township. He's our planning director. Rosanna Hoelzle from the village of Swanton, and Jeff Stopar, who's an attorney who deals with these things here. So it takes experts like these. It takes if you're involved in township government, in our structure we have a zoning commission and a board of zoning appeals also that helps deal with these sorts of issues, and they're going to get, these guys are going to get more specific about this, but it's something that is can be highly emotional for some people, can be very personal for some people, and so it can be of great interest and great challenge on it. So the structure that we're going to go with today is Rosanna's going to lead us off here, and then we'll go with Jacob, and then Jeff will finish up. We welcome your questions. If you have questions, please enter the chat area and write those questions out. And between Gilda and I, we will try to address those or present those questions at the end of the session here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rosanna and let you run with it from there. So it's all yours, Rosanna.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hopefully get this PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see here. We were practicing on taking over Gilda's screen, so I will have a little difficulty getting that. Okay. So that's me. As Bob said, I just want to give a little bit of background. So I've been at the Village of Swanton for just over 4 years. I'm the village administrator, so I oversee all municipal operations, and code enforcement and the zoning code are part of that. Before that, I was at Perrysburg Township. I live in the city of Toledo with my family, so I travel a lot from when I wake up to when I get home. So I go through a lot of communities. I just really want to give you a quick update or an outline of what we're going to talk about during my presentation. It's going to be, typically when I do this in person, I like it to be interactive. So if you have questions, please send those in so that we can make sure that we answer those questions. But I'm just going to go through some details on nuisances, code enforcement, maybe what you in your community are looking to do in terms of maybe bettering your current processes or evaluating them, where you want to be, and then talk about what we did in Swanton. So the first thing that we have is talking about nuisances themselves. So nuisances. If you're on this call, and we got a list of some of the participants, so I know that there's some code enforcement officials, some elected officials, and then administrators throughout the Northwest Ohio, Southeast Michigan. So code enforcement, like Bob said, can be a challenge, and it can also be, there's people that are passionate about trying to better their communities. So when we talk about code enforcement, what are we really talking about? I look at it in a couple different ways. We have these nuisances. These are real life pictures, by the way. I took these from our different years of enforcing the code here in Swanton. So we have our nuisances, such as like this couch on the front porch. Then we have some zoning issues where people haven't followed the code, putting up signs without getting a permit, putting up fences without getting a permit. And then we have property maintenance. So this is, you know, tall grass. That's typically the issue that we see the most is people not maintaining their property. So why is this important? Why is this important to talk about? So the important thing is, oops, I skipped a slide. Hold on a second. Go back one. Gilda, could you go back for me? I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulty. There you go. So when we talk about nuisances, why is this important? It's important because it affects multiple facets of our everyday life. The first thing that I think of when I think of nuisances is how it affects our quality of life. So if this is something that your neighbor had in their backyard, this picture here that you're seeing, would you want to go out on your back porch and try to enjoy the evening with your family? I probably wouldn't. I have 2 young girls. This is not something that I would like to see if I went out to my backyard. So it's affecting your quality of life. The next two, environment and public health. Nuisances, especially something like this, is impacting the environment and as well as the public health. So if you have junk and you have debris and garbage that's overflowing, is that attracting rodents and critters and things that we don't really want in our community? So is that affecting the environment and the public health? The next two, commerce, economic development, and property values. This is not really what you would like to see if you're bringing a developer into your community to try to look at sites for site selection or trying to entice people to want to move to your community. This is not really the picture you want to put on a residence guide or a welcome guide to your community. And lastly, we're talking about public safety. So when you have a nuisance, there's potentially vacant homes that are in your communities, and how does that affect the public safety and welfare, as well as unsecure lots. So are there vacant lots that there's things in the backyard such as this that people could potentially meander into, and that could affect the public safety. So at the end of the day, this is a pretty important topic for all of our communities. It does not matter what size you are. You can be a city like Toledo where I live, or you can be the village of Swanton. We're all dealing with very similar things. It just depends on the scale that we're dealing with it. Okay, so we'll go to the one that says, where are you now? So for communities that are, sorry, let's get to that slide. Gilda, could you go 2 more? Sorry. One more? Okay. So for your community, where are you now? So what are you looking at? What are you trying to get out of this presentation? What are you trying to look at for moving forward? So are you looking at your existing codes? This is pretty much the foundation of all of us. So my job is to enforce the code. So if your codes aren't updated or they need a refresher, that really is the most important thing. So looking at your codes and trying to see, are they clear in their definitions? Are they clear in the procedure, so that when you're conveying that to the public, that's easy to do. Where are you now in terms of your level of enforcement? Are you enforcing the codes? There's one thing to be said about having codes, and there's another thing about having codes and enforcing those codes. So each community is different. Do you have the staffing to do that? If you're a larger community, you might be able to have one person designated to do that full time. A lot of smaller communities are not going to be able to do that. We understand the resources are limited, but it's still important that you want to try to improve the quality of life in all of those areas that we talked about in a couple slides before. So that's really, really important. Could you go to the next slide, please? And then where do you want to be? So this is one of my favorite pictures. I like to look at it because it reminds me that we always have a way to do better. This is a real life picture. I didn't take it from any of the internet or anything. It's something that we took here. So where do you want to be? Do you want to have clear definitions? Do you want to improve the way that you're enforcing the code in your community? And do you want the public to buy into that? That's a really important part of code enforcement is public, and how the public interacts with your code enforcement officials or whomever is doing the code enforcement in your community. So what do you want the public's participation to be in that? So next I'm going to talk about what we did in the Village of Swanton. So this is going to be the bulk of the presentation. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is just an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it was like when I started in 16, how we've transitioned to where we are now. So 2016 environment. Could you go to the next slide, please? So when I arrived to the Village of Swanton in 2016, one of the things that I was tasked with right away was we need to enforce our codes. There was a lot of nuisances that were out there, a lot of what we call frequent flyers. I'm not sure if your communities have those as well. But if codes are not enforced, it's very difficult to then all of a sudden start enforcing it. So what we needed to do is I took a step back and I said, okay, we have these codes. I understand that my task is my directive was given to me was we need to enforce it. So what are we going to do? And how is that going to be seen in the public when for many, many years these codes were not enforced and then all of a sudden we're enforcing it? The other thing was, how are we going to enforce it if the job falls under the village administrator? I'm sure many village administrators are very well versed in this, but there are only so many hours in the day. So I made it very clear. I said, I could do this. I've had experience in this. I can definitely do this, but this is potentially a part-time job, or it really could be a full-time job to make sure that the codes are being enforced properly. And so I went to our village council and I presented them with an idea to hire a part-time code enforcement official. Like I said, I saw that there were some on this call, which is great. And council understood and saw the need and the importance of that, and they approved that. So the decision to move forward happened in the summer of 16, and we hit the ground running. Next slide, please. So again, this is a real life picture. And what we decided to do was we wanted to focus on the heavy hitters that were affecting in terms of nuisances, as well as zoning. What we were seeing was that there were many structures or fences or signs and things going up without getting the proper permit. And again, it was just the lack of enforcement. So we decided that we were going to focus on nuisance, heavy hitting nuisance. We needed to prioritize because there was a lot out there. And so properties like this is what we felt we needed to focus on. Not to say that the less messy or the properties that had fewer pieces of nuisance in terms of what the definition of nuisance is were not important. Those are important, but we only have limited resources. So we were seeking out the properties that were really heavy hitters, and that's what we decided to do in 2016. So the next slide. So what we felt was really important and something that I've been working on is codes. So if you're a township, you have your zoning resolution, you may have a property maintenance section. And if you're a municipality, you probably have either a charter or codified ordinances that dictate what is A, considered a nuisance, and B, what your procedure is to abate those nuisances. our codified ordinances need updating. We're well aware of that. And so we hired a third party to review our codified ordinances. So we actually hired Jeff Stopar, and he reviewed our code to make sure that we were up to date, that there was things that we may be missing. And the main thing was we needed to clarify our definitions. And you know, sometimes you hear the phrase, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I feel like it's the opposite with nuisances. And we wanted to have a clear picture to show the residents when we were moving forward with enforcement that this is what we are citing, that this is the nuisance specifically as it's written in this code. And so I highly recommend that if you have not reviewed your code or your regulations, please do so, because this is the backbone of everything that you need when you go out to try to enforce and try to ensure that your community is getting cleaned up. Next slide, please. So the way that we did this was, contrary to popular belief, we don't just go and cite somebody. So if I get a call that there's a nuisance on June 16th, we don't send a letter on June 17th. That's not how we roll in Swanton. We do things a little differently. So we have a courtesy notice. These are courtesy door hangers. I have ones that I'm ready to go post this week. These are meant to work with our public. We do not want to go and cite the public right away. We want to be able to work with our public and our residents, and we feel that it's important to have a two-way street with this. So these door hangers cite the specific definition, what we think is the nuisance, what part of the codified ordinances that we've just updated, and why it's important. And we ask, please call us to have a conversation. This was a game changer. We saw the progress being made exponentially. The ones that were the heavy hitters were the hardest, but the ones that were not the heavy hitters, within a couple weeks, we saw that these were being cleaned up, and we saw that the community was kind of rallying around. Now, again, there's some naysayers, and there were people that weren't supportive, but usually those were the people that probably had a large nuisance in their backyard and weren't used to enforcement of that. So these courtesy notices were a really great opportunity for us to also build relationships with our residents. We wanted to make sure that they were aware that we're trying to work with them. One of the things that was important with these courtesy notices was that there was a follow-up period. So when we sent these out, these 5-7 days later, we would go follow up. If progress had been made, then we would continue to work with that owner. If progress hadn't been made, then we started moving down the procedure that's in our codified ordinances. So if you do not do this already in your community, I highly recommend doing this. It's really easy. We use Tomahawk Printing in Wauseon. It's not a plug for them, but that's just who we use for our printing. 250 door hangers cost less than $100. It's not a major expense. And 250 can last you a whole season. So it's not like you're spending, well, in the village of Swanton, again, I don't know what your communities are relatively speaking, but it's not a very large expense, and that courtesy notice goes a long way. And again, it's just showing your community that you're trying to work with them. So I have a couple more slides and I'll wrap up. The other thing that we wanted to do is to show the public the updates that we were seeing and the progress that we were seeing. So that's a before and after. You can see that was a property that we had worked with. And what we would do is that we had a spreadsheet that we internally maintain. If you have a really cool software application that you can use to keep all of this and it's a data repository, that's awesome. Some smaller communities don't have the capability and the resources to do that. We literally just use Excel. We don't have to recreate the wheel. We're not doing anything spectacular. But what we're doing is that we're keeping track of all the touch points. So we literally, very simple, no progress, progress, complete. Those are the three categories. So have they been abated? Are they working on abating it? Or have they done nothing to abate it? And we, every week, would post this, and we would let the public know, this is how many places we've either sent a courtesy notice or we've actually had to get to the point that we've had to send a notice of violation in order to abate it. In my 4 years here, we've probably had less than 10 that we've had to go in, and the village has had to abate that. typically we're able to work with the homeowner and continuously work with them to get that abated. So again, this is a really great way to show your community that you're trying and that there's things that are in the works. So again, we're not doing anything that's rocket science here. It's literally Excel. That's a chart that we created in Excel. And obviously it shows our updates. So that was a very, very quick overview on what we've done in Swanton, and just to kind of set the groundwork for Jacob and for Jeff to kind of go into that. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me, but please send us in some questions so that we can make this interactive at the end. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Great, good stuff, Rosanna. Thank you for that. And next up on the agenda then is Jacob Barnes, who is the planning director at Springfield Township. So Jacob, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. Again, I'm Jacob Barnes. I'm the planning director at Springfield Township, Lucas County, Ohio. Have roughly 18 years of experience in planning and zoning. Township zoning is my specialty. I do have some experience in village and city zoning as well. But I wanted to pick up kind of where Rosanna left off and talk for a few moments about the zoning profession in general, and really how that relates to code enforcement. If you're new in zoning, you'll quickly realize that it's a thankless job. You'll receive way more complaints than you ever will thank yous. It's just the nature of the job. It's not an easy job either. I like to say it's a fine balance almost in everything that you do. For one, you have to deal with the public, and many times and in many communities, you may be the face of that community, the face of the township, the face of the village. And why do I say that? Well, many times the general public might not even know, for example, who the trustees are or who the council members are, but they may see you at their door there to talk to them about zoning. So the way you interact with the resident sometimes can really change their whole perception of the community, of the local government, either in a good way, or it could also be in a bad way. So dealing with the public is something absolutely essential to the job. When it comes to code enforcement, you're there telling them something that likely they do not want to hear. How do you do that in a way that you can really get the person to think and get the person motivated to action? It's definitely not an easy thing. No such thing as perfect zoning. There's zoning issues in every community that you go to, but how do you handle, how do you balance those things when you have to deal with the public in general, and then you also have to deal with the other side, the politicians. So there's many aspects involved when it comes to planning and zoning. And again, dealing with the general public, I liked how Rosanna brought out, we're not robots out there instantly issuing citation notices for every possible issue that's going on in the community. If that happens, I've seen it always ends up with problems and issues. You'll get the community as a whole agitated, upset. They'll eventually go to the politicians, and then before you know it, you have a huge mess on your hands. Obviously, we don't want to have something like that on our hands to deal with. So the small door tags, door notices that she showed, excellent suggestion for any community. Usually the person will see that, they'll be able to contact you, start that dialogue. It's always much easier to at least converse about something than for them to just simply receive a notice. When they receive the notice, they look at it, they're not going to be happy, they're going to stew about it, they're going to get upset, and it gets the whole process off to kind of a rocky start. when in many situations, the issue, the violation can be handled very, very easily. It's usually something that doesn't take a whole lot of action, something that can be handled in a quick amount of time. But the real key is when you're dealing with the public is getting them to understand, where the community is coming from. Many times they don't even know that they're in violation. I would say 90% of the time, probably, they don't know. So if you go into it with that mindset, hey, I'm talking to someone that probably doesn't know that what they're doing isn't correct. So you can even bring that out right in your first few words. Hey, we're just wanted to let you know, you probably weren't aware, such and such thing was in violation. So many times, by the way that you converse with the resident, has a great effect on their willingness to comply. I also mentioned dealing with politicians. Now, why is that important? Well, for one, I'm sure that your politicians don't want complaint after complaint after complaint, or people showing up to their public meetings up in arms with zoning. That gets tiring real quick. And many times you can prevent that from even happening to begin with. By the way you deal with the public, handling those issues, extinguishing those flames, so to speak, well in advance, you won't even get those people at your public meetings. You won't have those people calling your politicians, complaining, and then your department having to explain what the situation is, because as we know, people always have a tendency to blow the smallest issues way out of proportion, whether it's themselves that are in violation, or if they're talking about someone in the neighborhood in violation. It always sounds way worse than it actually is in reality. And when that gets to it builds up and builds up, gets to your local politicians, it many times appears that it's way bigger of an issue than really what it is, and really an issue that most of the time could have been handled between the planning and zoning department and the residents in general. Another thing is working with surrounding communities. It's important to have that consistency. For example, if you're in a township and you border a city or a village, you'll want to be in contact with those employees of that neighboring jurisdiction. Have an open dialogue with them. It always helps if your codes kind of match up, because the general public, they don't necessarily know where those invisible boundaries are. They assume, like for here in the Toledo area, for example, many people just assume this entire area is Toledo. They don't realize there's townships, there's villages. So the more consistent that you can be, especially when it comes to enforcement. I've heard in the past, someone will complain, well, hey, why is such and such business able to do this? Or why do they have this huge inflatable sign figure in their front yard and I can't have it? So many times if the enforcement's handled consistently between the municipalities, if there's an open dialogue there back and forth, that too can help both communities. Every community is different too. I think that's a big thing, is there's subtle differences. Every community is made up differently. Some communities, you have an easy job with trying to get community participation or community attendance at meetings. Some communities have no problem whatsoever getting that interaction. There's others that it's like pulling teeth. You can't get any kind of community input, never have people show up to your meetings. So everywhere it's different. So it's important to get to know the community that you're in, get to know the various dynamics that are going on. Like I said, it's in this profession, it's much more difficult than simply black and white, reading a regulation and enforcing a regulation. There's so much more that's usually going on that, again, that you have to keep balanced and keep in mind as you're going about how to enforce. Another thing that I think is important, and one thing that we've done here in Springfield Township, is community outreach. Now, what do I mean when I say community outreach? Well, you don't want to be known as, when you're going out and visiting with residents, you're going out and visiting with businesses, you don't want them thinking in their mind, what I do wrong now? Why are they here? If that's the case, you're going to have a pretty difficult job. So by community outreach, that is, going out, reaching out to businesses, reaching out to property owners. For example, in the business community, there's nothing wrong with stopping by, saying hi, introducing yourself, letting them know who you are. If you have a simple list of reminders, for example, that regulations that may apply to the business community, for example, your temporary signage regulations, other types of regulations that a lot of businesses, especially your franchises, the larger corporations, they go through a turnover, and many times the local manager just isn't aware of what the code is. So making friendly visits with those businesses, I think is very important. It builds a rapport with your local businesses. It helps them to have a positive view of the local community. And then by passing out, for example, maybe a few concise regulations with them, it helps them. They have something on hand. Then when they go to do those things, you don't end up with a violation, but you end up with someone calling you, someone coming in to apply for a permit, and it just makes things go very, very smooth. When we talk about community outreach, especially now with the way this pandemic has affected virtually all the businesses, I'm sure in your community, especially the restaurant industry, we've at Springfield Township have been reaching out to businesses right now via phone calls. Hey, how's it going? We just wanted to let you know that the township's thinking about you. Is there anything that we can do to help? And those phone calls go a long way in the mind of the business owner. They'll think about that after they're off the phone with you, and it no doubt will lead to much better relations in the future. And especially if you reach out to someone who maybe they've had a rocky past with the community, maybe they've been in violation, maybe they have a sour taste in their mouth. Reach out to that person as well. See what you can do to help them. That could change the whole entire situation with them. It could change their opinion of the local government, and it can help you as you go forward. In addition to the community outreach, relationships are important as well. Having a good relationship, for example, with your local Chamber of Commerce, if you work hand in hand with them, because they're very, very tied in to the business community, and the better relationship you can have with them, in turn, the better relationship you'll have with the businesses, and that'll have a nice trickle-down effect when it comes to code enforcement. And also other agencies. We all have to deal with perhaps county agencies or state agencies. Some of those agencies at times can be difficult to deal with, but having that open communication with them as well, that will help on so many things, not just with code enforcement, but when it comes to economic development, when it comes to increasing business in your community, that can have a great effect. With all the agencies as a whole, when they come together and are able to work together, a lot of really good things can happen. And speaking of code enforcement specifically, there's lots of things that we as planning and zoning officials can do, but you know what? There's also a lot of things we can't do. And unfortunately, the local community many times thinks that we can do everything. We can help out their every need, and that's what we're here for. We're sitting around waiting for them to call us. Obviously, as you know, that's not the case. You're all extremely busy people, but some in the community, that may be their perception. But it's important that if there's something that we can't help them with, steering them in the right direction. Definitely you can see the frustration from a typical member of the community trying to just get an answer to a simple question. Some things, for example, that they think that we can help them with, look at property line disputes. You probably all have that on a constant basis. What do you do about a property line dispute? They want you to come out instantly and tell them, where's my property at? Where's my neighbor's property at? We all know that, a land surveyor can do that. Your local planning and zoning department can't do that, but you can definitely facilitate that whole process. And it seems like as time goes on, many people just can't get along with their neighbors. I know I'm seeing that here just with the phone calls that we get. People just can't get along. Then they call and expect the local government to step in and be the mediator. And many times we can, but in other times we can't. They simply just need to talk to their neighbor. And I would say probably 95% of the time when I ask them, have you talked to your neighbor about this issue? They almost always will say no. And then followed by that, they'll say, well, we're not on speaking terms. We're not talking. They're difficult. They're a bad neighbor. And it's surprising in many cases when I get an initial phone call from a resident really upset, complaining about this terrible neighbor in the community, we go out, we take a look at it, and by the time we get right down to the bottom of it, the initial caller in some cases was the biggest problem in the neighborhood. So you just never know. You can never assume that what the caller is saying is correct, because many times they're putting a spin on it. They're making another neighbor look bad, when in reality, when you actually go out there and get to the bottom of the situation, it could be entirely different. So it's understanding a lot of those nuances and things that you have to deal with when it comes to the public. Another thing that they'll call a lot about is water questions or floodplain type issues, drainage type issues, disputes about one property draining onto another. And as you know, we're not drainage engineers, we're not drainage experts. So helping them navigate that situation. Again, I always encourage them, reach out to your neighbor, talk to your neighbor. Almost all the time, you can get it resolved between the two parties. And if it can't be resolved, you can send them to other agencies that can help them. Your local, either your city engineer or your county engineer. A lot of resources available when it comes to that. And that also touches on if you get a lot of fence questions. People wonder, where can I put a fence? Or is my neighbor's fence on my property? Again, educating them, helping them to see, you can get your property surveyed. That's usually a great help. You can keep your things on your property, but many times, and Jeff may touch on this as well, there's some issues that just lead to court. No matter how good you are, no matter how much help you provide to the person, that thing is, the matter is going to end up in court. And just a couple last brief things I'd like to mention when it comes to violations. And Rosanna mentioned this as well, but it can't be stressed enough, is your zoning resolution or your zoning ordinance or your zoning code, whatever you call it. Very important to have that document up to date, to have a document that is easily enforceable, a document that's user-friendly. I've had the privilege of helping out on several zoning codes in the past. Each one's different. A lot of the township zoning codes are very similar because they're based on the Ohio Revised Code. Obviously, villages and cities can go above and beyond those regulations. But in any case, it's important to have that document accurate, to have it so it doesn't conflict with itself. And it should be a document that's constantly being looked at, and really about every 5 years or so should be looked at in its entirety and updated as needed. That'll really, really help you when you go to enforce the code. And speaking, the last thing I wanted to mention is the process itself. We mentioned reaching out, having a dialogue, the importance of that, not simply just sending a letter. But when you do have to send that letter, the tone of your letter can have a huge effect on the person as well. Your initial notice should be a very kind notice, stating you're probably not aware of this situation. Here's what we found. Here's what the code says. Please see if you can reach out to us. We'd like to talk to you about this. That right there will solve a lot of the other violation issues that you couldn't solve by talking to them. But then if you have to go further, more notices is better. And Jeff will agree with this, that you don't want to show up to court and have the judge ask you, well, how did you notify this person? What did you do? And if you simply say, well, we just sent out these couple notices and we came right here, you have a hard enough task as it starts with in court. Judges don't want to deal with zoning typically. So the more you can show that you've really bent over backwards, you've really tried to work with this person, that will help you immensely when you end up having to actually get to court. And it helps to show that you're not the big bad municipality. No, you're trying to help the resident. You did everything you could, and your last resort was filing in court. That'll help immensely when you have to get to that process. So those are a few pointers I wanted to share with you in regards to zoning, to the uniqueness of the job. You can't go out and get a degree in zoning, and that's why these conferences are so important. Sharing our own experiences with each other and kind of really learning as we go. And if we do that, we'll be able to enforce things very reasonably and have good success. So, thank you for your attention, and now Jeff next.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that. And yeah, we'll bring Jeff on here right now. One thing I'm going to have to work with you on, Jacob, is my preference is elected official versus politician. I like that terminology a little bit better. So, but thanks for that. And Jeff, we'll turn it over to you from there.
All right, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Jacob and Rosanna. And this is kind of interesting for me. By the way, you don't need to really look at my written materials. They're there for you to look at in the future. I'm going to kind of hit on some more broad thematic topics, and we'll kind of go from there with the questions. But I have to share this to start out. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she's noticed I was wearing a suit jacket today, which I have not done much of lately. And she asked me what I was doing. I said, well, I was speaking at a conference. And she asked me on what? And I said, well, it's on nuisance, which means we're trying to help people take care of their properties. And she pauses and just kind of said, huh, sounds boring. I'm like, okay, such is my life. But, and it's kind of interesting. Again, my name is Jeff Stopar. I've been an attorney in private practice here in Toledo since 1999. And my practice involves zoning and nuisance law. And I kind of do both sides. I represent local governments in some instances, and I represent property owners and private individuals in some instances. So I'm going to jump, since we've heard from Jacob and Rosanna on the local government side of things. I will kind of give my perspective on nuisances from the perspective of a property owner. And for better or for worse in my career, I've done some work for individuals that have gotten notices regarding nuisances. And I want to kind of give you a little bit of their perspective as we talk about this. And the one thing I've learned from talking to people that have gotten notices is they don't realize that it has escalated a lot since they got that first friendly call or friendly letter or friendly door hanger from the local government. They have no self-awareness on that issue. They think what they're doing is fine. The city, township, or village is out to get them, and they're picking on them. And the first thing they'll say to me as their lawyer, look at what Joe Schmo down the street's doing with his property. Look at what Jane Schmo's doing with her property. I'm not the problem, they are. And it's always hard. And once it's gotten to that point, that's why, as Jacob said, it's far down the path when the lawyer gets called on behalf of the property owner. So a lot of what has to happen in those instances is to, for me to ratchet them back, look at what needs to be done to get the city or the village off of their case so we don't end up in court where we could get daily penalties. And the other topic that I want to hit on a little bit, and it's the other kind of what I would call a stakeholder in your garden variety nuisance issue, is usually the neighboring property owner who probably called the complaint in to the local government. These are the calls that Jacob and Rosanna get on a regular basis. My neighbor across the street isn't taking care of his or her property. It's ugly. I take care of my property. And I was thinking about this morning. This just occurred to me this morning. I would like to think a good number of the people on here have seen the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood. And what I picture is, if you know the general plot of the movie, is Clint Eastwood is a widower. He has a nice piece of property he takes care of meticulously. He's good with he's very handy around the house. He's good with tools. He has this 1971 Gran Torino. The kid next door tries to steal that Gran Torino and gets caught. And then his family has him go volunteer with Clint Eastwood to do work on his property. And Clint Eastwood starts putting him to work on the neighboring properties. He's sick of looking something wrong with the roof across the street, a tree stump across the street, and that's how the movie progresses from there. But I think in terms of him, and he's saying, I take care of my property, why can't these other yahoos take care of their property? So those are the calls that Rosanna and Jacob are getting on a regular basis, of people that are very meticulous and think any little piece of chip paint or something like that merits a call to the city or village. So those are a couple of our stakeholders. And I'm going to hit on a couple of the issues that Jacob and Rosanna mentioned, and it's really important, and Rosanna hit on this, and I think Jacob did too, that you got to have a good code. And a good code does a few things. It's clear, especially with a city or village, that you have a good definition of nuisance. And probably, if I'm giving legal advice to a village, I'd say I'd rather have you have a broader definition of what a nuisance is than a more narrow one, because then you have a hammer on people if you're trying to compel compliance. But, it's a big but, having a hammer doesn't mean you need to use it all the time. But I'd like for you to have, if something's wrong with property, that you have it in your code, that's considered a public nuisance, and I can enforce it against you, whether it's through daily penalties or other abatement activities. So you have a good, clear code, and that means, as Jacob said, updating it periodically. And updating means a couple of things. Updating means, number one, adding things into the definition of nuisance, clarifying language. But the other part of updating, and I see this a lot when I look at codes, whichever side of the ledger I'm on, is a lot of people don't go back through and eliminate outdated sections or confusing sections. They get ticked off with one particular issue, add a section on it, and don't think about how that fits into the rest of the scheme. And that's what's important too when you go through and update your code periodically, whether that's zoning or nuisance. That's good advice. The other thing that I like to think about in nuisance codes is to make sure that you are providing due process, whether that is set forth in the Ohio Revised Code. For a township, it's 505, I think, 0.86, 505.87, and various sections of the Revised Code for municipalities, or in your own code. You got to provide due process. And I always like to scare local governments about this, that if you have a good code that provides due process, the worst thing that can happen is somebody's going to tell you whatever it wasn't a nuisance, unless you violate federal law. And an easy way to violate federal law is to not provide due process. You don't want to give some property owner who hasn't been taking care of his or her property the ability to come back and say, that doggone village denied me of procedural due process, because that gives them the hammer, and they have, that's about the only hammer you have as a property owner, is a claim under section 42 USC section 1983. It's a claim for a violation of federal rights under the Constitution or federal statutes, and it allows them to get monetary damages and their attorney fees. That's their hammer. So don't give them that hammer ever. Always make sure you provide due process, and err on the side of giving too much process to people if you're really taking significant abatement action against them. If you're demolishing, make sure you follow the statute meticulously. If you have to provide more time, you do it. I just don't want to be in a position where there's some question as to whether I provided a property owner a procedural due process. And I won't bore you with all the constitutional law on that, but the more significant your property right you're taking away, the more process you have to give them. And most of the statutes in 505, 86 and 87 take that into account. If you, and I wish I could ask for a show of hands, but I do get the sense, I'm going to circle back around a little bit here. I don't want to go over too much. I have a time written down as to how much time I have. But one thing I always want the government to keep in mind is that, and Rosanna and Jacob hit on this big time, is the first contact should always be a soft contact. I remember having a conversation with Rosanna when she told me that those hangars are working. I remember the initial thought in my mind was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if you're getting good compliance by taking the soft approach, don't use your hammer, and don't even get the hammer out of the toolbox. But if you have that person, there's going to be the frequent flyers, the ones who seem to want to fight. That's when you have to use your hammer. But that's also, as Jacob hit on, it's also when you need to make sure you're meticulously documenting things, and both in your paper file and in the notices that you send out to the landowner. And I remember distinctly one time, and I really don't do these things anymore because I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I remember one time I was in a municipal court and there was an enforcement by a city against the property owner, and he stood up to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I don't understand what I need to do to comply." And that judge was not friendly to my client one bit, and he was known as being a very stern judge. But what my client said, he didn't know what he specifically had to do to comply with what the city was after him for. He required the city that day to provide him a detailed list of what he had to do to his property to comply. So you never want to leave those things ambiguous, because that's how things ratchet up. And you don't want to overly nitpick on people. You want to keep your eye on the big picture, the properties you're getting the most calls on, and try to avoid that situation where you're going after somebody because it's that house you drive by all the time. And I find myself doing this. I live in Perrysburg. There's a house I drive by all the time. I don't call the city or anything on it, but I always think, why can't they take better care of their property? And you have to be careful about picking on people for just being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Apply the same standard on First Street as you do on 4th Street, and that makes it a lot more easier, and it comes across as a lot more fair process to the general public. So thank you for your attention. I'd rather not, as opposed to me babbling on here, I'm happy to turn it over to the group to answer any questions that anybody might have.
All right, very good. Thank you, all three of you, for the information there. I've taken some notes as we've gone through here, and some of the key things that I have heard are use things like the door hangers. Those seem like a great tool to be able to use. I like the progress reports also, Rosanna, that you mentioned on there, posting those things. I heard a lot about open communication, clarity in communication, being specific sounds like it's really important in there. Jacob also mentioned the idea of the community outreach, which I think is really important also, that you don't want to have the first and only communication with the government entity as being a negative one on there. So taking the opportunity to reach out and do some positive things. One thing I will mention, and Jacob I think started to touch on this, but one of the things that we did when in Springfield Township during the COVID-19 issue, based on recommendation from another entity, was to reach out to some of our restaurants in the area and say, hey, we're going to waive the requirement for putting out signs saying that you're open for business, and really try to encourage things there. So we stretched some of the normal requirements on there and made that a very positive outreach. And I think Jacob would say that he got some very positive response on those things. Other things that I heard, really important to have clear zoning resolutions or code to be able to help enforce things and focus on the big violations, right? The things that are most visible that cause some of the biggest challenges. So Gilda, did you have specific questions come in? If you did, I didn't see those show up in the chat, but if you have those, that would be great. As I said earlier, I do have some questions that I can share with people also. But if you had questions come in from any of the attendees, I think it'd be great to share those right now. So Gilda, if you're out there, if you could share some of those as well.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
There was a question if this was being recorded. So yes, this is being recorded, and TMACOG will share this probably on our website on our main page. There was a question for, I believe, Rosanna.
Yes.
Find it actually.
I'll tell
I'm
you
not
what,
sure.
Gilda, yeah, while you're looking for that, Gilda, let me throw out a couple of questions here, and then you can come back to that. But I'd be interested for any of the three of you, or maybe all three of you, if you can. People, I think, learn often by stories, by incidents that you may have. So, if you were to recall maybe the most challenging incident that you've ever dealt with in the zoning and abatement issue on there, what might that be? Rosanna, you're nodding your head there like
Yeah,
you
I have one.
think of
That
something
one
real
off
quick.
the top of my head.
Yeah.
I think the most challenging one is a property that the property owner is still living but is no longer living in that home. So the issue that we had is that we had an absent property owner and was using that as basically storage. So kept bringing over things to the property, but not living at that property. So we got many calls from the surrounding property owners saying, nobody's living there, nobody is there, but they keep bringing stuff over. And you could see, like, from windows that they were piling up. And that was probably the most difficult because the homeowner was elderly, didn't live in town, but still owned that property. So how do we work with that person? Because this was not just there was some garbage overflowing out of their garbage bin and the neighbor didn't want to look at it. This was massive, a very large lot, lots of accessory buildings that were overflowing, plus the home that was overflowing. So, do we get the health department involved? Is it a public nuisance that was affecting the public welfare? So that probably is, to me, it's always in the back of my mind as the worst one, just because of the nature of the sheer volume that needed to be abated. I just won't forget it. We were able to work with actually the children of the property owner because they acknowledged that there was an issue. So that was something that we were happy to be able to start slowly working with the property owner's children to get that taken care of.
So what you had to do then was just to find out who it was that actually could do something about that then, and I'm sure that took some work, some research to be able to do that.
Yes, it did. You're trying to use as many resources as you have. One of the things that we do here is when I come back after I do my field investigations, field work, and I'm driving around, what I try to do is, do we have any contact, like phone, email address for that property owner, whether in our utility billing software, whether through our tax, utility, we have income tax, utility billing, we have data on that. If there's an email address, if there's a phone number, even though I've already put that door hanger on there, I'm going to try to reach out to them as a second soft touch point and just say, hey, I left you a door hanger. I just want to let you know if you have any questions, give me a call back. So that's an extra step that we try to do here. It doesn't always work because we don't always have that contact information. We're not out blasting people in emails or anything like that. That's not what we're trying to do. But if we do have that, it's great. But that can be difficult if we don't have that, which took a while with this situation that I just mentioned.
Yeah, good. Jeff or Jake, any incidents come to mind?
Yeah, a couple actually came to mind. The first is kind of more general, but agricultural exemption. And I know we could have a whole day of conference on that, but I can't tell you how difficult it is in several cases in the past where property owners will use the agricultural exemption, try to use that to their advantage. And many times it actually works and really frustrates the local government because you finally get into court, and I've seen them pull that, kind of pull that out from the side. Oh, well, by the way, this activity such and such was agricultural, and it's really difficult to convince a judge otherwise. When that issue gets brought up, it can make it extremely frustrating on the local government's side. And a couple other situations like that, they'll use that. We had one violator, I remember, that would always come into court and say, oh, I'm just a poor farmer, I'm a veteran, and go on like a whole long list of things, and why am I getting picked on? So they've always used that agricultural exemption. I've seen that used many, many times. So that's one difficult one. The other one I wanted to mention, a specific situation. We had a property where the individual he was basically a scrapper and continuously brought things onto the property, had commercial trailers. We went on and on with this for probably a couple of years, and we were in court for various reasons. We couldn't get anywhere in the court, and then we took the angle that under the Ohio Revised Code, it's the same area where you can demolish a structure, you can remove a vehicle from a property or remove a violation, like abate a nuisance, essentially. I think it's 505-86. We went that route, and it came right down to it. We actually selected a contractor. We had our public service department. We set a date and said, we're going to be out here at, I think it was 8:30 on a Friday morning. So we show up at the property with a whole army of vehicles, myself, our administrator, a few public service employees, and then our contractor with his semis and trucks with his equipment ready to abate this nuisance on the property. We arrive, and all of a sudden the property's kind of like it's kind of barricaded with fencing, and it's a unique property to say the least. But we hear an individual over a microphone. We can't see the person, but we basically hear someone shouting on a microphone that please step off the property. It started making some threats, basically, that if you want this to end peacefully, please leave. And we had a few sheriff's deputies there as well, so we could just kind of sense this whole escalation. It got right up to the point that if we forced our way onto that property, there probably would have been a huge shootout. And the individual was unstable individual who had been in prison, and just an example of we backed down on that one, but it goes back to the frustrations that we have, because then we just had to continue dealing with it. We didn't want to make a spectacle out of the situation. We didn't want to be in the news for shootout caused by zoning violation or anything like that. That just sticks in my mind as one of those cases where it really, and then we had to go back to the drawing board and spent a few more months, but gradually by talking with that individual, he was able to remove some of the things, and kind of like one of those out of sight, out of mind ones that I'm sure he's got stuff there, but you can't really see it. So we're not gonna, but that was a specific example. I don't know if you remember that one too, Bob, but that was a crazy situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff, anything that comes to mind for you?
No, I don't want to talk about maybe a specific case. The one thing that is coming to mind is as I think through these things, so many times, again, in my practice is taking calls from people that are accused of having nuisances on their property. The number of times I talk to somebody, I turn a lot of clients away on the grounds of, look, I would much rather you take the money that you were willing to spend on me and just fix up your doggone property. And you come out way ahead, because then you're going to hire me. I'm going to ask for a retainer. You're going to have to do something to fix up your property anyway. It doesn't make any sense to hire me. And don't give me the idea that you're picked on by the big bad government. Take care of your property. It's not that hard, you know. And sometimes it is, and sometimes there are circumstances that, but most of these, the people I'm talking about are people that are fired up thinking they're being picked on. And so many times the economics of it don't add up to give me a call. The economics say, sit down with Jacob or Rosanna, figure out exactly what I need to do, and get a time frame and get it done.
Yeah.
And that's a synthesis of a lot of individual conversations I've had with property owners.
Yeah. Great advice on there. So and maybe we should write this down. We've got an attorney who's saying, don't hire me on there. So that might be unusual advice.
Well, and I speak from experience in the sense that I've learned over the years is that somebody who's not willing to spend money to take care of their property is generally not very willing to pay their lawyer's bills.
Good call. Yeah. All right, Gilda, did you find that other question?
I did. So it says our police department does our code enforcement. They have difficulty getting because we don't get much support from our court system. We have been told by Fulton County Western District Court that porches used for storing items such as couches pictured in Rosanna's slide, as well as our random junk, can be stored there because porches are extensions of the home. Therefore, their interpretation is that can live there. Seems a little weak, but is this something that we deal with? And do you guys have any thoughts?
Wow, that's a stretch, man. So Western District, we do district here, but well, it depends on where in the village. We span 2 counties, but that is definitely a stretch. I'm not sure who that question is, but if I'm happy to have a direct conversation with that. I know when you have the local law enforcement involved, sometimes there's some challenges with that because especially the public perception. I think Jacob talked about that. You know, if enforcement that's coming out and trying to enforce your code, you know, what does that look like? What's the perception from the, you know, John Doe at 123 Main Street? What is he thinking of when a police officer is coming? One of the things that this is kind of an aside, I've always had this idea, and I don't know how it would work because there's a lot of or hoops, and I think people would poke holes into it. But for a lot of smaller communities, especially here in Fulton County with these 12 townships and smaller municipalities, you know, why isn't there somebody that could, you know, potentially help all of these communities? And so that you have this one person, as Jacob says, the face of that. I think that that's really something that's important, is who is the enforcing this code. So that's a kind of an aside to answer the question, but I unfortunately I don't have enough experience with the Western District and the judges who are making those calls to actually accurately give an answer to that. I don't know if Jeff, from a legal perspective, it's a very interesting topic to be discussed further.
Let's just say this, that I'll jump in with a couple of quick thoughts. Is number one, I would think that most municipal ordinances regarding nuisances would include a couch on the front porch as being nuisance because it's visible from the street. It's still something from the exterior that you see. And so from that perspective, I still think it might be, I'd have to look carefully at the language of the township sections of the revised code on that to give a further opinion if it was in a township. But I guess I would respectfully disagree with the judge. Now, but here's maybe what the judge is communicating, and this is a follow up on a comment I made earlier. Having a hammer and using a hammer are two different things. If the judge feels like you're being a little heavy-handed or haven't given good notice, then that could be a reason why the judge is reluctant to enforce. So there could be some other factors at play there. It's really hard to comment in a vacuum as a hypothetical how that might play out.
The only thing I wanted to add to that real briefly is that also it goes back to your code, your definition of nuisance, because that's obviously going to be talked about in that case. You know, is a couch a nuisance? Maybe not always. Maybe in some cases it is, but having a really comprehensive definition of nuisance, and if you can, on the local government side, if you can definitely place that item within the definition of nuisance, then you probably have a halfway decent case. But if there's a lot of questions around it and it may or may not really fit into that definition, then could be a difficult time in court as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think like Jake, just to expand on what Jacob said.
Go ahead, Rosanna.
I was just saying that, you know, what we talk about here is recreational vehicle, like a trailer, like an RV. If I have a neighbor across the street from me, we live in Old Orchard in Toledo, maintains this RV, it's beautiful, they wash it like every weekend, it's park it in for the day until they take it to where they go. But is that a nuisance? Are they in violation of anything? So what we've talked about here internally is when does something, so if somebody on their porch wants to have some nice furniture that they've purchased, that's nice, beautiful outdoor furniture, or to a couch that's dilapidated and, you know, fabric is ripped and things like that. So that's why the definition is so important to help, you know, go to that next step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeff, you were going to add.
And that goes to writing the code, and that's where, you know, I'm a lawyer and I look at language, but what I usually do is when I talk to local governments about these things, you know, I'll tell the code enforcement person, look through my definition of nuisance and think about your docket and think about, does this cover everything on your docket in the way you want it covered? And that's the best way. You're not going to be able to write legislation to cover every possible situation that's going to come up. You just want it as broad as you can so that you can reasonably enforce your code, and everybody understands kind of what the rules are. That's all you can ask for.
Yep. So along that line, where does compromise come in the interpretation of some of the zoning codes that we have to deal with? Should they? I mean, you can make an argument, you know, and I'm in the human resource field also. There's you know, we write policies and those kind of things on there. Should there be strict interpretation of the codes, or is there room for compromise when you're trying to deal with these things? Anybody
I'll
want
jump in. As the lawyer, I'll jump in, and usually with regard to, there's a fair amount of law out there in Ohio in talking about zoning. The zoning codes are, you know, restrict property rights, and therefore they should be construed in favor of the property owner. So if there's ambiguity there, sometimes the property owner could get the benefit of the doubt. As far as compromise, and that goes where there's always what I would call enforcement or prosecutorial discretion. That no law enforcement agency goes out there and enforces every violation known to man. I mean, you don't pull somebody, you don't see people getting pulled over for going 61 in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. And at some point, you need to make your decisions, because I mean, looking at it from a small municipality standpoint, you don't have unlimited resources to chase down all of those. So there's inherently some compromise on those points, which goes back to my big picture point of going after the worst nuisances and the ones you get called on the most. That's where you want to devote your scarce resources. That's how I would view it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to consistency. You know, if you're gonna give one property owner the benefit of the doubt you should probably give another property owner the benefit of the doubt in a similar situation. You know, I've seen, you know, in different time periods and different years and stuff, you know, there's always, you know, like for example, right now with the COVID-19, you know, we're really trying to focus on, you know, the safety issues, picking our battles wisely, as Jeff brought out, the worst of the worst. But as long as the consistency is there, I think that's key. You can't just make general compromises in certain situations and not in others, and you know that then leads to a lot of issues.
All right. Gilda, any other questions that you came up with? I have a couple others that I can throw out here as well, but if we have others.
There are. Yep. How could code enforcement for low-income residents and or homeowners that may not have enough funds to address issues, like how would low-income or homeowners who don't have funding, how would you work with them to address the issues if they don't have the funding?
Yeah, good question.
I mean, that's a great question.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jacob.
I just wanted to comment, just to start on that, is many cases don't require any expenditure of funds to maintain a property. Some do, yes, but in a lot of cases, the work that's required requires very little, if not no financial expense to bring it into compliance. One thing that the local municipality can do, and one thing we've done is, you know, someone's got a large pile of trash or large furniture that is part of the issue. We'll offer to just go pick that up and help them out with that problem. We'll make some special allowances to, you know, when somebody's in a really difficult situation to try to help. You know, it's just it's a case-by-case situation, but the local government could step in and help out in certain situations.
Yeah, and something that I was going to mention is we provide a list, you know, St. Vincent de Paul, Salvation Army, all of these places that do take furniture, you know, all of these things that would be of no cost to the owner. The other thing that, especially if it's grass, like right now we have a couple properties that are tall grass. If I'm able to get in contact with that owner, you know, the things that I would recommend would be maybe reach out to the Boy Scout troop. I have the contact for a Boy Scout troop. I have the contact for the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, you know, places that are service oriented that may be able to help them. National Honor Society always looking for service hours. If you have an 8th grader who's making their confirmation, I'm sure they have to have service hours. So if you're able to make those relationships and continue with those relationships, and then when you do have a low income or someone who's not able to do it, because like Jacob says, more than likely it's not money that needs to be expended. If the property has gotten into such disrepair, I think that's a different conversation. But if we're talking about garbage is overflowing, the grass is high, you just need to clean up a little bit in your backyard, if you have relationships with your community organizations, I'm sure that you will able to find a group of people that would be willing to go out there for an hour to help straighten it up a little bit.
Good. Jeff, anything you'd add?
That's usually the frontline things that Rosanna and Jacob deal with, but I'll throw in a 2 cents in that, and then a lot of Jacob's correct that sometimes a can of paint or just a little bit of effort to clean up can take care of the broad majority of issues. If there's somebody who's low income and there's developing some obvious from the outside structural issues with the property, that's a whole different, you know, that's a whole different health and safety problem where they need to reconsider whether that's a safe place to continue residing. So every situation is a little different on that, but it does get difficult if you're talking about, you know, somebody's living paycheck to paycheck and they have a $5,000, they need $5,000 for a roof on their house. Those are difficult calls, and I have no in my desk drawer here. I don't have the magic wand for that one.
And some people also just use that as an excuse or a stall tactic as well. They may have the funds, but it's much more convenient to say it that way, and then, you know, to start getting the courts sorry for them and the government sorry for them. So I've seen them try to use that to their advantage too. So it all depends on the situation.
Yep. Okay, good. Gilda, any other questions?
You guys are very popular, and there are actually.
Yeah, good.
This is an ongoing issue for 10 or more years. This property is owned by a scrapper. We have a clear code and we have tried to work with this property owner for years, but got no results. They would appreciate some comments that you would like to give them on how to deal with this issue.
I'll throw out one thing that I've seen work when I've represented somebody that isn't taking care of property, and that is that if you're in a municipality, you have the authority to make maintaining a nuisance a misdemeanor, and which could have a $100 fine per day of violation. And while a judge is going to be very reluctant to bring the hammer down on somebody for 30 days of violations, if it's their first offense, if it's an ongoing problem, then I think you can have far more leverage in bringing those charges, bring on somebody of municipal court on misdemeanor charges of daily offenses. That would be my one.
I would suggest meeting the person where they are. So when I'm out and about, I'm typically not wearing heels and a dress and things like that. I'm wearing jeans and tennis shoes, and my hair is pulled back, and I'm kind of boots on the ground kind of thing. So in that, I suggest trying to meet them where they are. And I know that that means a lot more, like physically meet them where they are, but maybe, have a conversation with them on, this education, right? That's a huge part of all of our jobs, right? Education, education, education. The struggle is, it's not that, like you said, they may just not understand what the procedure is. They don't understand. Maybe they do, and maybe they're trying to take advantage of it, but maybe they don't understand. And like I suggested with the situation that I had here in Swanton, I was able to reach out to the network that I had. And so like I went to our police dispatcher who's been here for 40 years. And I said, do you know anybody who's do you know anybody that's affiliated with this person? Maybe reaching out that way. I literally just did that last week with just a tall grass situation. The person passed away in the fall. The wife is not able to take care of it. I just mentioned the name, and I was able to find a sister who lives a couple blocks away who called me and said, yep, we got it taken care of. Like literally that took a day, and I didn't have to send out a notice. I didn't have to do anything. It was literally just, I was able to reach out to my network and say, hey, how can we look outside the box? How can we try to tackle this? Because what we've been doing is not working. So let's try a new approach.
That's a great suggestion. And the only thing I had to add to that is on some of those huge issues, if it's a problem that's been festering and increasing for maybe decades, and it's to the point where the local government is trying to see what they want to do with it, in addition to the communication with that property owner, is if you can just get them on some kind of a schedule to make some type of progress. Even if it's going to take them, it could take them a year, it's still quicker than the most fast civil court case that I've ever seen. So if they can just continually, like on a weekly basis, make observable progress, I've seen that tactic work as well, because it's still going to be much quicker than the legal system. I'm sure Jeff would agree with that.
I usually refer to the glacial pace of litigation. Yes.
Yeah.
Especially in a COVID world. Yes.
Good question.
Yeah. Very good question. Good answers.
Second to last question. What is the biggest difference with code enforcement between townships and municipalities?
Municipalities have a lot more authority to define nuisances in their codified ordinances than townships have. So just under the Ohio constitutional setup, municipalities, unless you're a home rule township, and there aren't a whole lot in the whole state, municipalities have far more authority to define nuisance and to enforce them than townships, who have their provisions outlined in Chapter 505 of the revised code, and townships have only those authorities expressly provided to them in the Ohio Revised Code and necessarily implied from those powers. There is a reduced amount of discretion with townships. from a pure technical legal standpoint, and I'll leave it to probably Jacob to comment a little bit because he has more of a working knowledge of the comparison of the two.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that, when you're comparing a municipality with a township, for example, and Jeff touched on this earlier, with the municipality, a lot of them simply have a zoning violation as a minor misdemeanor, which in the whole scheme of things, kind of like a slap on the wrist at most. The person can show up and pay their $100 fine or whatever and be on their way, and it leaves the municipality back at square one of refiling. And so some municipalities I've seen will take that minor misdemeanor and I think move it up to a misdemeanor, or move it up on the charge scale so that their fines can go up. There are some judges out there, and I've actually seen this a few times, it's rare, but will actually fine residents. It's extremely hard to do, and definitely don't count on it in the court system. But once the penalties are at a certain point, even the most hardened violators will start to take notice of that when it starts really affecting their pocketbook. But even so, I want to also say that in the grand scheme of things, even municipalities still have limitations, and it can be difficult to deal with the most hardened of violators. There's no perfect scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Last question, is it legal to have a code violation a tickable offense in at least a municipality versus taking the owner to court as a deterrent?
Say that one more time, I'm sorry.
I'll repeat. Is it legal to have a code violation a tickable offense in at least a municipality versus taking the owner to court as a deterrent?
So yeah, I believe that a municipality could, a ticketable offense, is that what you said?
Yes.
There is a section of the Ohio Revised Code on that in part, and I stumbled into it recently. Give me about 10 seconds, but generally speaking, I think that there's some authority for municipalities at least to levy civil penalties for certain types of violations. And there is also a section. There's also some ability to have non-criminal land use infractions under Chapter 765 of the Ohio Revised Code for municipalities. So those would be my quick answer to that. So I think yes, but you have to be careful on how you do it.
And most municipalities will shy away from that a little bit because the council and the mayor don't want to start getting those types of complaints. If those are strictly ticketed and strictly enforced, then you go back to kind of that issue with the community getting up in arms, and then those complaints getting back to the elected officials. So a lot of them don't. I don't see a lot of them that do the ticketing, but I think it could be done.
All right. Well, very good. I think that brings us to the conclusion of our event here today, and I appreciate everybody joining us. Great questions, great presentations by all of you. Appreciate your expertise. Gilda, I'll leave it to you to finish closing out here then.
Thank you all very much for being a part of this TMACOG Tech. I really did try to fix my camera, so I'm so sorry that I'm still a black shadow. We just have amazing windows here at TMACOG. But also, we plan to send out a survey. This is our first time doing this, so thank you to all the participants and to all of the panelists who did work with TMACOG and partner with us on this TMACOG Tech. We do, like I said, plan
Yeah, Gilda, I don't know if it's true of anybody else, but I lost you there in terms of your
It sounds like sending out a survey.
Yeah, your audio is out, I think.
Yeah, Bob, we're not hearing Gilda right now, so do we want to, is there going to be a survey that will go out to the attendees?
Yeah, that's what I'm sure that Gilda was talking about there, is that there will be a survey that'll be sent out, and I'm sure that the recording will be available to anyone who was on this call today. So with that, apologize for some of the technical challenges that go along with that, but again, I guess we're probably all used to some of those that come up as well. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.